Welcome back to the sweatshop today, boys and girls. We are lifting this Ford F-150 in the front a whole 2 inches with these wonderful Bilstein shocks. Our first step is going to be to open the hood. Once you have your hood open, you can then see your strut mount. There are 3 bolts on either side that retain the strut mount. They're much more visible on the driver's side. You can see them all there. Your next step is going to be to figure out how to lift this truck up safely. That, I think, is the most challenging part of this job. It is a beast. This thing is heavy and big. Lots of room is the key, and it's something I can say that I don't have currently. You need a gallery to have people laugh at your jokes, Jim. It's so much fun being a mechanic by yourself. The toughest part of the job is going to be lifting this thing safely and correctly. If you are attempting this at home, it's not something that is extremely difficult to do. It is just ridiculously dangerous if you don't support the car properly. Make sure you use jack stands and the appropriate jack to lift this vehicle up and jack it up from the appropriate place. If you're lifting it with a hoist, great. Just make sure your hoist is properly rated. Let's get to her. Next step is to remove the wheels on either side. If you're doing this job on a hoist, I suggest not sending the hoist up all the way. Take the wheels off with the vehicle at a relatively low height. That way you don't have to lift this thing. Be careful not to throw your back out. Let's do the other side. We are currently looking through the wheel well. As you can see, your bolts are entirely accessible from the top here. You don't need to crawl through the engine bay to get them. It is absolutely possible to do this in the driveway. The most important thing is that you make sure the vehicle is supported properly and that it doesn't fall on top of you, because that will be lights out. Our next step is going to be to remove this shock as a complete assembly. In order for us to do this lift, we're going to need to reuse some of the components from the old strut assembly. Essentially, we are going to reuse everything from the old strut assembly except for the shock itself. To remove the strut assembly, what we're going to have to do is crack these bolts loose. Hopefully they come out without too much of a fight. Once we get those bolts up on the strut mount, what we're going to do is release the 2 bolts that we have on the bottom here. There's one here and one back there, which is kind of hard for me to film, so you'll just have to trust me that it's there. Get your favorite 18mm wrench and crack them all loose. If yours are a bit rusted, you'll definitely do yourself a favor by employing the use of some WD-40. If not, just work them all loose like this. For the back bolt on the top of the strut, I did use a ratchet with a shallow 18mm socket to get to it. It was a bit easier than using the wrench. After you get all 3 bolts released from the top mount, your next step is going to be to get these 2 bolts here released from the bottom of the shock. They are 18mm. You can use a gun or a ratchet, whichever one makes you happy. Once you get those bolts out, the next step is to get the shock out. It looks a lot simpler than it actually is. There is quite a bit more work to do, and it would definitely help you if you had a friend to help you grab the shock while you pry down on the lower control arm. Unfortunately, I don't have a friend, so I'm going to be doing this on my own, which means that you can as well. You just got to be extra careful. First step is going to be to remove this bolt, separate the joint. Your next step will be to remove the tie rod end. You're going to separate this bolt. It's a 21mm. This one here is an 18mm. Before you go ahead and do that, you have a 10mm that needs to be released so that these cables don't get chafed or stretched in any one of the attached sections. So they're attached in multiple places here and there, and a couple of clips up here. You want to make sure that you release this one so that it doesn't stretch. When you release the tie rod and then the joint, the arm is going to want to come back. Just make sure that you keep it closer towards the vehicle. Otherwise, you could have your CV shaft come out of its out of socket, which won't be good. And you could stretch these cables, which won't be good either. The other thing you're going to do, because we're not reusing the shock, is remove those studs. You'll need an air hammer to pound those out through the top this way. Just be careful with the back one because your CV shaft is there. You don't want to hit that boot and destroy it by accident. So be gentle, be careful, and good luck. That's nice. Don't forget your 10mm before you release the upper joint. And now just hammer the joint right on this raised section of the upper control arm. And that's that. You can now go ahead and remove this shock. Just make sure you're feeling strong. If you're not, go and get a friend, because this thing is really kind of awkward to handle if you're doing it by yourself, and it's heavy. Make sure that your lines are nice and free and they're not hanging up on anything or being chafed or stretched. Now, in order to get this shock out of the way, what we're going to do is employ the use of a 56-inch pry bar. We're going to stick this pry bar between the lower control arm and the subframe. And we're going to gently pry down and lift the shock up and out of the way. Once you get it released and it's out of the little area in the control arm, you can then pull the shock out all the way. Oh, it's so awkward to do. There's your shock. Now that we are at that point where we can now separate our strut from everything else that we need to reuse, it is a good idea before you separate it to use a marker to make sure that nothing is out of place. What you want to do is line everything up so that you know where stuff came out from. Now, there are a few different methods that you can use to separate your shock and spring assembly. This process is extremely dangerous and really something you don't want to try if you don't have the correct tools. If there is a local shop that has a strut compressor like this, I suggest going there because it is way safer and much easier to do, and they're probably not going to charge you an arm and a leg. You can do it with a tool like this. Usually it's two of them on either side that you clamp onto the spring like this, and then you hit it with an impact gun. These, depending on where they're made, which usually everything's now made in China, aren't the greatest of quality. So if this bolt breaks for whatever reason, that spring holds a shit ton of pressure and it can potentially kill you, or it'll really screw you up, that's for sure. So heed the warning. If you're not comfortable with using this, I don't blame you. Go and find a friend who has a strut compressor like this to make your life easier. Now, that being said, make sure you've marked it properly. You look at the angle of everything and the way it's lined up. What you want to do is mimic the same exact position on your new shock. Once you take a little bit of the pressure off, you're going to release that top nut, which I think looks to be a 16 mil, and then your strut will come off. I was wrong, it's a 17 mil. With your top retaining bolt out, your next step is to slowly back off your strut compressor and have this thing release nice and easy. The best advice I can give you is to take off as many pieces that stay together. That way you're not guessing where what was and all that fun stuff. Shake it loose from the bottom. Don't forget your rubber stop. Our next step here is going to be to separate this pad here where the spring sits, because we're going to need to reuse this on our new shock. How we're going to separate it is by tapping this pad on either side till it breaks free. Hopefully that works. Now, before you can transfer all of your old stuff onto your new shock, what you need to do is get the spring seat off of this old shock. What you're going to need to do is get a punch and a hammer and smash this cap off. Don't be afraid, it doesn't hold anything, it's just slightly pushed on there. I found that out by risking my life because I'm stupid like that. After smashing this off, you can then remove your spring seat. Then get your new shock. When you get your new shock out, what you're going to do is make sure you look at the angle of this piece here. It does not move. So if you try to move it while it is on the car because you put it in backwards, you're going to cry. The second step is to adjust your height to whatever you want, and then follow the rest of the instructions for reassembly. Cut this guy so that it releases the shock. This portion of the shock here will rise, which is normal, and then adjust as needed. Now, once you slide your spring perch on and you have your shock set up in your spring compressor tool, what you need to do is figure out how to keep your shock from sliding out of the spring perch, because of course there's no friction fit. One thing that I can tell you that's important is to make sure you read the instructions for your particular strut. If you have Bilsteins, you're going to want your collar to be like this. Make sure it sits nice and firm at the height that you want it to sit at. And then you want this to slide all the way down on it nice and flat. If you have a friend who is very brave and trusts you, you can get them to hold the shock while you compress the spring. Is a very dangerous process, so make sure that you maybe don't care about that friend so much if you do mess them up. If you don't have a friend and you are by yourself like me, you can employ the use of some wood and a jack. You're not actually putting any pressure on the jack, you're just supporting the shock. Your next step will be to line up the marks that you previously put on the shock if you listen, and place a spring in place so you can compress it easily. Place it into position. Take your time, just as needed, my friend. Now with your spring and everything in place, you want to make sure that your lines that you had previously put on the shock, spring, and perch line up. Once you get everything lined up, make sure that this shaft here is lined up with the strut mount. You want it to line up with the hole so that it will protrude. It is a bit of a pain when this is loaded up to try and maneuver it. So do your best to line it up. It's a good workout. You should make sure that you have a good hearty breakfast, because it's a pain in the dick job to do. Okay, you keep compressing if you're using this style of compressor until you see it bottom out. Start to send the shock down a bit. That's how you know you're good to go. Our next step here is to look at our instructions. Our Bilstein instructions say that we are supposed to have a washer. Mr. Bilstein lied, because there is no washer. There is a lock nut provided in our particular kit. I don't know if someone was asleep at the factory, but we're going to forego the washer and put on just the nut. We should also just dump these in the garbage because they weren't really helpful. Thanks, Uncle Steenie. Take your nice new nut, place it on, thread it on by hand, and then get the appropriate socket and hammer her home. I don't know what the torque is. It doesn't look like the 17 is the appropriate socket, so we're going to go and find out what that is and then fire home the nut. Uncle Bilstein provided us with a 19 mil. Well, boys and girls, that's all she wrote for this shock. Now we have to repeat it with the other side. Unless you're just doing a lift on the one side of the truck, then you just got to put it back and you're done. Oh, yeah. No, they're still heavy. They're not any lighter, so take your time there, eh? With your new shock assembly assembled, what you have to do is prepare to put it in. What I like to do is grab the 3 nuts that hold the strut mount to the vehicle and use them to hold the strut mount to the vehicle. So what you're going to do first off is take your strut, slide it into place sort of. Once you have one of the strut mount bolts protruding through the frame, use one of the bolts to keep the strut in place. Your next step is going to be to place your 56-inch pry bar between the subframe and lower control arm. You're going to pry all the while pushing up on the shock and over the hump on the lower control arm to get it into that little space where it should be sitting. Ugh, Jesus fuck! Once you have the strut sitting in its proper position, the next thing you're going to do is go to your Bilstein kit, grab the bolts that are supplied and the nuts, and drop them through. Now, if you did not get a Bilstein kit and your kit didn't come with these bolts, you can reuse the original bolts. That's not an issue. As long as your bolts are relatively lined up, sometimes they need a little bit of precision. Gently tap them through and then put your nuts on to retain the bolts. Now all we got to do is put everything back the way that we took it apart. Your next step is to take your small pry bar here and then pry down on your upper control arm. Then take your pry bar, the hook side of it, hook it underneath the top ring, and then position your spindle in place. Then pry down on it as much as you can. Then get another pry bar. Use your other 24-inch pry bar to get it into place, and then secure it with the appropriate fastener. Now with your upper control arm in place, there is no chance of your spindle falling out and then stretching your lines. So you can now go ahead and put the 10mm back that holds the bracket that secures all these lines. Your next step is going to be to take the 21 mil that secures your tie rod and thread it into place. Now what we're going to need to do is torque the bolts to the appropriate specs. Here's a tip: when tightening up the nut for the upper control arm, what you want to do is put your 18mm ratchet wrench or regular wrench, whatever you prefer, on, and then take an 8mm wrench, hold this one stationary, and then you can crank it on. That's how you get these on without having to put all sorts of pressure on the control arm to bind up the joint. On the tie rod, it is the same thing. The only thing that is different is you'll use a 10mm wrench on the tie rod and a 21mm socket to drive on the nut. Now, the most important thing in completing this job is to make sure that you torque everything back to the appropriate torque spec. Find out for your particular application. There are many different types of Ford F150s and some of them do vary. So be sure to check with the manufacturer's specifications that are appropriate for your vehicle. The upper nuts for the strut mount are 52 foot-pounds a piece. The lower nuts and bolt is 66 pounds a piece. The upper bolt joint retaining nut is 46 foot-pounds, and the tie rod and nut is a 76 foot-pound nut. And your final step, once you get everything torqued down properly, is to put your wheel back. Just before you put your wheel back, make sure you lubricate the hub so that the next time you go to get it off, it doesn't give you a headache. Make sure that you torque the wheels to the correct torque spec. In my case, it was 150 foot-pounds. Hopefully you are happy with the ride height that you chose. If you are, the only thing left to do is to go and get an alignment. After that, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss one of my new videos. We will see you in the next one. Move that tab over to your left. When you are removing the wheels, if you're going to be doing it on a hoist, be sure to take a wheel. Is it recording? Of course, thanks. It is completely in order to do this lift, we will need to reuse some of the components of the old. What the fuck am I saying, Jim? If yours are a bit rusted, if yours are a bit rusted, you'll definitely do yourself a favor. Stop shaking, truck. Once you have all your bolts that hold the shock secured to the, fuck. This is heavy. Where did I put that shit? You look at the angle of the, come on, let her go. The shock, or not the shock, tapping this spring seat off or perch off. Oh, you know what? Should get the plate out of there, Jim. Okay, now, before you can put everything on your old, what? To make sure that they'll actually fit. What the fuck am I saying? Maybe don't care about that friend so much. If you do, fuck them up. If you don't have a friend like myself and you're by yourself, stop rambling and do the damn job, Jim. Wear this, fuck, and start to sub. If it makes you feel better, I can make up a number. Our instructions say, fuck, this thing's so heavy, man. Use one of the bolts to retain. Fuck you. Use one of the bolts to restrain. Your next step is going to be to get your 56-inch pry bar. Once you catch your breath, fuck. This fucking joint's so shit. Fuck. Don't get hit in the fucking face. Oh, fuck. Your next step is not to get hit in the face like I did. Here's a tip. Here's a tip for you if you're trying to get this thing to... Here's a tip. When trying to bolt up the... Oh, fuck. In my situation, it is a 2017 Ford F150 Lariat. In my particular application, it is a 2017 Ford F150 Lariat XLT, I think. No, what the fuck is this thing? For my particular application, the upper nut is 52 foot-pounds, the lower nuts for the shocks, and the upper bolt joint retaining nut is 46, and the lower retaining nut for the... Fuck off. Find the fucking torque specs out for your particular vehicle and torque it properly, bro.